Everyone. Greetings from Brussels. Welcome to this discussion. Dark times indeed. Full-scale war has reached Ukraine today. From early reports, we can hear that Ukraine and Russia are trading intense blows in the north and the east of the country. Also in the south, it seems that Russian forces are rapidly pushing out of Crimea. Earlier this afternoon, we also heard reports that some districts right outside Kyiv have been bombarded and taken by Russia, among them the Hostomel airport just outside the city. On the other hand, we also see that the attacks so far today have not reduced significantly the Ukrainian military, and the Ukrainian armed forces are still standing their ground. No matter what, this seems to look like a very tough fight. In any case, I think it's clear that we can conclude that this is not a intervention or limited small intervention. All sides of the country are right now under attack. Later today here in Brussels, leaders of the EU will be meeting. They will be discussing more and tougher sanctions on Russia. Obviously, the question is whether these sanctions will change the behavior of Russia, if not in a short term, at least perhaps in a mid or a long term. So this is one of the other issues that we want to discuss today. Also, what the response will be from the United States. We've seen a very coordinated and united response so far on both sides of the Atlantic. So we'll also take some perspectives from the United States as well. I am being joined by a variety of colleagues from GMF. We have Michał Baranowski from the GMF Warsaw office with us. We have Martin Quencez from the Paris office with us as well. We have Liana Fix joining us from the DC office, but that can also give perspectives on German position. And last but not least, welcome also to Vice President Kleine Brockhoff joining us from GMF Berlin. So we have about 60 minutes for this conversation. I'll have each of my colleagues share a couple of perspectives from their capitals. And by all means, please do send in your comments, your questions. I'll be monitoring the Q&A feed quite closely. So let me perhaps go to my colleagues who are now the closest to the war zone. Over to you, Michał Baranowski, to share some perspectives from Warsaw.
Thank you very much, Bruno. And it's wonderful to be with everyone online and with my colleagues from across Europe and across the ocean, even though this is, as you said, Bruno, a very dark day. Let me start maybe by saying that until the very last moment, until yesterday evening, very smart Russia observers here, much smarter than I am, still assume that Putin will not do what he just did. This was what we are seeing playing out in front of our eyes is really the maximalist scenario that the Russian observers have been predicting, or actually not predicting. So this is not a small war. This is a big war. Many of you might have seen the maps of targets around Ukraine, and it is indeed all over the country, including Western Ukraine, in many ways preparing perhaps, but with less and less of a question mark for a land invasion. So that's point one, number one. We are in a fog of war, but I think we should have by now learned that we need to listen to Vladimir Putin, what he says, and when he says it, he often then delivers on this. And his declaration of war in Ukraine against Ukraine very much suggests that he will try to change the government in Kyiv, and he's on the way attempting to do it. As Bruno said, Ukrainians are fighting. They are much better prepared than they are in 2014, but especially when it comes to air defenses, they are not as able as Russians, and they are taking heavy losses. So what is to be done at the, we can be looking at the moment, and I'm happy to answer anything that we see on granular level, but I think it's also actually time to acknowledge the bigger picture, because the bigger picture, the events are moved so far that from something that is happening only right now, the bigger picture is coming to us fast. So point number one, my suggestion or my recommendation would be that we actually acknowledge that we are in a different world, that the post-Cold War era is over, that we are in a new Europe, less secure Europe, in an era not of competition, but in an era of confrontation. And let this really sink in across our capitals, across our alliance. This is certainly the feeling here in Warsaw. Things are sinking in very quickly here. Secondly, we need to absolutely punish Russia for what Russia did, and actually, frankly, Belarus as well, because Belarus is not only enabler but actually a culprit in this attack. Not only the land invasion, but also missiles have been launched from the territory of Belarus. Thirdly, perhaps most importantly, we need to do our best to help Ukraine. They understand that right now they are fighting alone. They need military help, they need weapons, they need humanitarian help. Bruno, you mentioned this, we might be seeing, so far, people are just starting to trickle in, but given the size of the attack, we are likely to see big migration flows. And we need to help Ukraine in humanitarian help, in humanitarian ways and in economic ways. So that's the main challenges ahead of us. This is the situation from Warsaw, and let me stop here, and happy to, and then we'll, I'm sure, engage. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Michał, and thanks for pointing also to the immigrants issue. The President of Moldova just tweeted that today already 4,000 citizens crossed the border to Moldova. So this is actually really happening. Let's not underestimate that. Over to you, Marta. In Paris, your president, Macron, was heavily invested in brokering peace with Russia. So what are the reactions in France?
Yeah, thank you, Bruno. Happy to be with you today. Maybe to give you a sense of the position of President Macron. He gave a speech earlier this afternoon, highlighting first the seriousness of the situation. He used pretty much the same words as Michał just used, underlining the fact that we've clearly entered a new world and a new chapter in the history of Europe and the history of France. He also talked about the need of unity among European partners and NATO allies, and I think very much promising that France would support the sanctions and support all actions in favor of Ukraine that will be decided today and in the days to come. There was also quite a symbolic aspect to his speech, because he was standing in front of the French, European and Ukrainian flags. And this was, I believe, the very first time that a French president stood for this kind of official declaration in front of a foreign flag. And finally, there is also an element of public communication. So he said that he would give a formal message to the French Parliament tomorrow, something that, again, doesn't happen that often. I think the last time that the French president addressed two chambers of the French Parliament was after the Paris attacks in 2015 of President Hollande. So there is very much this effort to explain to the French population what is happening and the implications of the current war on France and on French citizens, because this is something obviously that will be important as we talk about sanctions and as we talk about bearing the cost of our support to Ukraine. It's very important to have this discussion with the citizen. You reminded us that Macron was very much involved in the diplomatic effort prior to the invasion. I think the reading here is that there was absolutely a need to make this effort before the decision to invade was made, because it also helps us counter the Russian narrative that the West is not ready to dialogue with Russia. So the fact that Macron went to Moscow, the fact that Chancellor Scholz went to Moscow, the fact that President Biden was also ready to engage in a dialogue with Vladimir Putin is very helpful in calling the bluff that the Russians are trying to portray the West as close to any of its demands, and that we've forced Russia to make the decision to invade. So that in a way has a value in itself. The second thing is that clearly there is absolutely no trust in Paris for the Kremlin. President Macron keeps talking about not being naive. I can tell you from our discussions with French officials that there is absolutely no sense that the words of Vladimir Putin can be trusted. And in fact, something interesting is that they also repeat that Russians lie in public as much as in private. It is not like as if when they pretend that they have no power over Wagner in Mali in public, then in private they have a much more constructive discussion with the French president. No, President Macron and his advisors have got the exact same lies from Vladimir Putin when they talk behind closed doors. So there is really no door for dialogue right now. And in the media over the past 24 hours here, we've had many reported discussions between Macron and his advisors. Macron saying that the last time he saw Putin, clearly Putin had changed. It was not the same Russian president he had met for the first time in 2017. He saw Vladimir Putin that he defined as obsessed and paranoid, someone who was not interested in talking about the future, but only reaffirming the grievances of the past. Just to finish, I think the French position here also is that obviously this is, and unfortunately, this is only the beginning. That as much as we are seeing sort of a worst case scenario with an invasion of Ukraine and Russian troops going much further than some of the scenarios that might have been envisioned before, this is still not the end. Even if Ukraine is entirely invaded, this will continue, the fight will continue, and we should be prepared for a struggle that will take months, if not years. And this is, I think, a very important message that the president made, that all European leaders have to talk to their citizens very quickly to make them understand that this is a long fight.
Thank you very much, Martin. And staying for a while in Europe, over to my colleague in Berlin, Kleine Brockhoff. Thomas, Berlin was also involved in peace talks, of course, in the past weeks and months, Germany being part of the Normandy format too. So what are the reactions now in Berlin?
Thank you, Bruno. And we don't have yet what Martin was reporting about the speech of the president and the attempt to explain to the citizens what is going on. But there is behind the scenes a vibrant debate about what went wrong and what needs to happen now. And the question of what went wrong is one that is being conducted with the mirror in front of us. This is an inner German debate, and I will quote a Twitter entry from former Defense Minister Annegret Kramp-Karrenbauer, now a private person, who said the following, a tweet that has gone viral: "I'm so angry at ourselves for our historic failure. After Georgia, Crimea, and Donbass, we have not prepared anything that would have really deterred Putin." Now, she saying this is probably the person who was pushing hardest for being prepared and taking that hit for all of us. So I think what we are seeing here is the end of all pretense, the end of all illusions, the beginning of a new age, and the necessity to think through German foreign and security policy in a new way. Now, I would and this country probably more than any other will need to change here. There are some countries that can talk in a told you so manner. Germany is not among them. Now, but let me spend 1 minute on making clear why there is a reason that this country is the last in the convoy and has the longest path to travel to catch up to the reality that Vladimir Putin created in the last 48 hours. This was the ultimate status quo power post-1990. The post-1990 setup was the first time since the industrial age that the German question seemed to be solved. And that is why this country hung on to a fraying status quo longer than any other. And stuck to it because the consequences of a change for this country would be so grave. Now, I will grant you that there was also illusions and also conveniences, because the business model of getting security from the US, getting energy from Russia, and having a market in China is pretty convenient, a great place to be in. That business model died over the last 48 hours and will need to trigger a fundamental rethink of what German foreign and security policy is and will mean. The decision to cancel Nord Stream 2, or suspend, as it was said, nobody can believe that a suspension is not a cancellation, is opening the door to that rethink, because it is, I would say, this is the moment where this new coalition really started. It is the moment when this chancellor took his first independent and controversial decision, and that decision was mostly direct against part of his own party. This is what governing is all about. This is the strains that come with governing, and he has opened the door to changing the road forward and to adapt to the world that Vladimir Putin forces upon all of us. Now, what are the three things that I see that will be looked at here? One is there will be an attempt to, not just domestically, but to clean up Europe from the corruption of oligarchy and dirty money in this country as in other countries. The second is we will have a spirited debate about energy policy. The idea that we go fossil free will need an update. We will need to go Putin free before we go fossil free. That will be a very tough question for the governing Greens, that there is a geopolitical component in energy transition. And energy transition was based on a fair weather assumption that there is moderate energy prices, that there is no inflation, and that there is no geopolitical strain. None of these preconditions exist today. So we're going to have a very spirited debate on that. And finally, there is going to be a very robust discussion about German defense. Yes, there was talk of 2%. There was a little headway towards it. This will all change now. To what degree, I can't say. This is all too early to tell. But if you combine these things, that will be a heavy rethink. There will also be short-term things to be done, and they go beyond helping Ukraine, which I don't want to repeat because Michał already mentioned this. But there will be options and things to be done in the neighborhood. There will be bolstering things in areas like Moldova, Romania, Georgia, the Balkans. A lot of areas where Mr. Putin could have designs will need to be addressed. We will need to repair relations with the Baltics. There will be troop deployment questions to be solved with the Baltics, with Romania, and yes, with Poland. I would see the NATO-Russia founding act as dead. Three documents will need to be looked at anew, and that is the U.S. national security strategy, not yet published, the German national security strategy, not yet published, and the NATO strategic concept, not yet published. All three will need a rethink after what happened these last couple of days. So I will stop here. We could go on. I'm sure we will. I'll stop.
Thank you very much, Thomas. And I can echo some of the things that you said about the NATO dialogue. Also here in Brussels, we hear that the current rotational strategy in the Baltics and Poland might well shift to a permanent presence, given the circumstances. But we'll be seeing what happens there. We'll cross the ocean, across the Atlantic. We have Liana Fix joining us from Washington, D.C. So Liana, over to you for reactions from your location.
Well, thanks so much. I mean, certainly in Washington, it was a very short night as everything unfolded yesterday in the early evening, live to be observed. I would like to make a couple of points, and I would like to address a couple of blind spots that I think we should be aware of in what comes next in the next days and weeks. And I see 4 points, 4 blind spots that we have to take more serious. The first one is US intelligence and military analysts who know the region have been 100% right with their predictions. Those are laid out. Everyone can read them online, and it's very clear. It was very clear from that perspective how this will develop. This means that we should also take serious the reports and that have emerged in the last weeks about what comes after the initial stage of the campaign. We are only at the initial stage, and this can become much more brutal and much uglier than we expect it to be. And what I mean is the reports about lists compiled already now by Moscow on pro-Ukrainian activists, anti-corruption activists, on camps, and what else. So we have to prepare for human rights, let me call it violations, is perhaps not strong enough as a word, which will give the whole campaign even a very different picture from what we see right now. So this is really just the beginning of what we see, and we have to take it serious how Russia will behave itself in Ukraine. And this will not be, according to those reports, if we take them serious, this will be very ugly, and we have to reach out and offer our support, especially to those who will be the targets. And I just remind of the language of the Russian president in his speech yesterday night at 5:45 Moscow time, when he spoke about a denazification of Ukraine, a demilitarization, and he also spoke that those responsible will be put on trial. The speaker of the Kremlin, Dmitry Peskov, today spoke of liberating and purging Ukraine. This is all language which is very, very concerning. The second blind spot is the Russian, I mean, this is not a blind spot, this is pretty obvious, but I think we have to take it into account that there was an immense Russian military dominance. And that it will be, and I don't want to sound defeatist, but this is something which is almost unwinnable for Ukraine. And the aim, as Michał argued, is, if we see the campaign unfold as it is now, is certainly regime change, seems to be regime change in Kyiv. So we might have to move quickly to think beyond, to think in a post-campaign scenario, and to think almost past the immediate campaign. And what I mean is, what do we do if the Ukrainian army is defeated? Do we have a common stance on arming insurgents and on arming the Ukrainian resistance? And this might become, in addition to other points, one of the contested point in the alliance. because some will certainly argue that this will lead to further escalation, will lead Russia to, and the Russian president to invoke exactly the threats that he made yesterday night against everyone who wants to meddle into that. So what do we do if the worst comes true and the Ukrainian army is defeated? And we might think about how we deal with a potential insurgency or resistance. The third point is that this will, and this has been said before, that this will be a longer conflict. So this is not only about Ukraine, and by that I do not mean a NATO-Russia conflict. I don't think this is in the cards. This is not going to happen. All sides do not want it to happen. But Russia has laid out in writing its demands, and those demands did not only cover Ukraine, those demands covered European security too. So we will not see a NATO-Russia military conflict, but we will see crisis, and we will see, after Russia has been successful in Ukraine, attempts of coercing and threatening Europe to achieve the aims that were laid out in Russian demands towards European security. So we will see down the road, let's think about 1 or 2 years, a couple of security crises also between Europe and Russia. Again, I don't think there will be no NATO-Russia military escalation, but there will be instances of coercion, bullying, and so on from the Russian side that we have to be prepared for. And the fourth blind spot, which we just start thinking about, is very much, what does this all mean for regime stability in Russia? Does it strengthen regime stability? Does it weaken regime stability? I mean, what is certainly the case is that the Russian president is dragging along his population, who's not convinced by this war, at least definitely not comparable to the state it was convinced in Crimea. And he said it very clearly in his declaration of war yesterday night, that he expects the Russian population to take a patriotic stance and to support his decision. And saying this out loud means that you consider it necessary to say this out loud. And if we sort of remind us of the meeting of the National Security Council, it became very clear in this meeting that there definitely this top elite of the Russian security sphere was very nervous and was dragged into compliance with the Russian president. I mean, most of them certainly agreed with what he was planning, but this was a show of loyalty to strengthen his regime and to keep everyone equally responsible as he is for what is happening. So what does this mean for regime stability and for repression in Russia down the road if the protests, and we've already seen now the protest is the little protest that we see is trying to be quelled in Russia? What will this mean for regime stability and for repression within Russia in the future? All not very happy blind spots that I had put here up, but I think it's worth thinking about it and discussing it.
Liana, thank you very much for broadening our thinking on this issue and pointing at some of the things that actually do matter as well. I see that another colleague of mine just logged in, Jonathan Katz, also joining in from Washington. Jonathan, we are taking from respective capitals. Please let us know, what have been your observations so far?
Yeah, and I apologize, sort of jumping from some different things, but just off the phone with some colleagues in Kyiv, sort of talking to them about the current situation. I think we all saw the immediate reaction from the Biden administration yesterday in terms of condemnation and placing the blame for this current crisis on Mr. Putin, and also the responsibility in terms of loss of life. This is shared across the board with transatlantic allies and partners who are in lockstep with the United States. My expectation, and I haven't been able to look yet, but I know that there will be a new rollout of sanctions if it hasn't already happened in the period that I've been sort of on screen this morning. And I expect those sanctions to be severe, significant, and I don't expect that to be the end of, what the U.S. and partners are planning to do. Of course, there's a grave concern about the humanitarian, challenge ahead as well, which can't be ignored. I think one thing that struck me, and I've said this a few times, is the chilling language of Mr. Putin about demilitarization and denazifying Ukraine, which is code word really for many of us in Washington looking at this for an openness to commit atrocities in Ukraine. And so I think there's an increased level of concern about the willingness of Mr. Putin to commit significant atrocities. And I think there's a real importance then to raise the level of concern about human rights, humanitarian assistance needs, including in countries that are already seeing Ukrainians come across the border, like Moldova. And so I think right now in Washington, it's a multi-pronged situation where they're looking both at the economic sanctions component, looking at humanitarian assistance and what can be provided, additional assistance, and also I think concerns about the safety and security of the Ukrainian government itself and Mr. Zelenskyy, and the importance of continuity from that perspective to have that Ukrainian government continue to be speaking, but also really in opposition to any planned attempt to replace that government in Kyiv with a proxy, as Russia has sought to do. There is also great concern about the role of Mr. Lukashenko and Belarus in this. And I think that what you are likely to see as well is a complete tie-in on sanctions and focus on Mr. Lukashenko. And then lastly, I would say this, we haven't talked a lot lately about the idea or how the US might and others might support an insurgency in Ukraine. That moment is here as well. We haven't, we're in the day 2 or day 1 of this initial phase, but how the US and allies and partners approach this issue is something that I think we haven't heard a lot about publicly. But as you recall, President Biden spoke very specifically about the United States providing that assistance to insurgency. I suspect that planning is happening right now. And again, I think while there's always the door for de-escalation and also Russia withdrawing, I don't think anybody expects that to happen right now. And also completely dismiss in Washington any idea that this is an operation about the Donbass alone. That's been thrown under the bus, by the actions taken by Mr. Putin. So, more to come from Washington. I will say this, the political scene here, as you know, over the last, several weeks has been interesting in Washington too. You have splits within the Republican Party on approach to Ukraine or the Biden administration's approach to support. And my hope is that we'll see strong statements like we've seen from Senator Romney about this situation, about the need to support Ukraine. Russia is the aggressor here, and that we double down and re-emphasize the support for NATO partners and allies, especially those countries that are on that front line, like Poland, like Slovakia, like Hungary, countries, the Baltic countries as well, with the change of equation, and Belarus. And last point, and I promise to end here, is the administration will soon announce its national security strategy, and this current situation will dramatically alter what that will look like in terms of military and force posture, the investment in the U.S. military and defense. And I think that you're going to see, sort of a two-tiered approach. One will include this increased level of support and funding for the U.S. military to fight a type of war that we, I think for the last 20 years in the war on terror, that the United States shifted away from, and partners did as well, to something that really faces the reality of what Russia is doing right now. But the other one is the issue of democracy and values.
Jonathan.
Will be doubled down.
Okay, thank you very much. Sorry to cut you short, but we have just a limited amount of time and many questions also from the audience, which I want to turn to right now. Let me try to perhaps bundle some of the comments that have been made on the Q&A feeds. Many viewers are wondering about, okay, what is the Western response now, and what's the impact of it? Maybe if basically we are wondering about what would be the impact of the sanctions. Will this really help to change Russia's behavior, whether in the short or mid or long term? What can be done in the short term beyond sanctions? This is also a question that we see, because indeed right now it seems that a lot of our bets are being put on sanctions, but what else can we do? And perhaps to take one more question also is about how will NATO respond now on the border? Should we be deploying EU battalions? Should NATO's high readiness task force be coming in? How do we defend our most eastern NATO member states? So on that, Michał, perhaps can I get back to you? Has there been requests from Warsaw to beef up the deterrence in the country?
Thanks, Bruno. Yes, there has been, first of all, there has been a request that was granted and for Article 4 consultations this morning, and the North Atlantic Council has passed a statement to this effect earlier on this morning. There is absolutely not only concern, this is really, to put it mildly, that the conflict, this war can spill over on purpose, or perhaps not entirely on purpose. We have focused so much on Ukraine that we have not yet talked much about one other very significant development that has happened a little bit under the radar, which is a de facto soft or military annexation of Belarus. The 30,000 Russian troops that's supposed to have left after the Belarusian military exercises have not. They have started building training bases, which is basically the Russian bases on the Belarusian territory. We expect as for hundreds to be arriving there pretty soon. We even today saw attacks from Belarusian soil to Ukraine. This changes the geography of the northeastern flank of the alliance quite dramatically. For the Baltic states, it means that they are really surrounded by de facto Russia. For Poland, it means that we now have a very long border between Kaliningrad and Belarus, and Kaliningrad has more tanks than Germany, Holland, and Belgium combined. So this, just to give you the scale, and this is without the 190,000 that are now surrounding Ukraine. So the force posture is absolutely inadequate right now to militarily deter Russia. And we are definitely in a moment that Putin is gambling. So this is where I don't know to what extent it's been made public, but there will be certainly a request from Poland, and NATO's reaction force will be coming very soon. And also, as you may know, the Secure has received basically a mandate for more flexibility in moving the forces, NATO forces around, and the plans have been activated. So we are seeing NATO is paying attention to Article 5 territory. It's moving, and it will be moving very soon, very quickly.
Thank you very much, Michał. Thomas, the EU is now talking about harsher sanctions, such as stopping technology exchange, cutting access to European capital markets. Will sanctions help to change Russian behavior? You're muted.
From what we hear from Moscow colleagues, sanctions matter, sanctions hurt, but sanctions don't change Putin's calculus right now. Whether that will change over time and that what that could do is anybody's guess. But I like to remind us all that sanctions is a tool, but not a policy. The more crippling these sanctions are, the more likely it is that we will stand here and ask ourselves, can we uphold this? Do we want to uphold this? What do we want to replace this by? Duration of sanctions is going to be a very important element. Secondly, I was listening to financial analysts yesterday. The sanctions that were put in place yesterday only targeted 1 out of 5 systemically relevant banks in Russia, and only to 2% of the overall assets of banks held. So far, until whatever happens today and during the next days, these are sanctions, at least with regard to the financial sector, that sound tough and are geared towards our own constituencies, but will not change Russia's behavior. Now that might change, but as of yesterday, that was clearly not the case. We should also consider that there can be countermeasures. Russia has prepared for this. It is the only country that at the same time, except for Singapore, I believe, that at the same time has a current account surplus and a budget surplus at the same time. So they have deep pockets to deal with this, and they can enact countermeasures, and the countermeasures would likely happen in the commodities field, where especially rare earth, they have large reserves that we are dependent on. This morning, Gazprom declared that it was going to uphold gas deliveries, but what if they choose to sanction us? So I would think about how to think these things through. In the chat, I've seen a number of questions about SWIFT. SWIFT is a double-edged sword, because it is an instrument that is, as we've been seeing with Iran, can be very effective, but it can only be very effective once. It's also a self-destructive mechanism. The Russians, certainly in collaboration with the Chinese, have prepared their own payment transaction systems. So yes, it can be effective, but its effect may come to roost you. Now, Western analysts say that the bank sanctions and the export bans that are presumably in the pipeline are the much more efficient ways to tackle that problem.
Thank you, Thomas. Maybe over to Martin. We've talked about the sanctions now, but as some viewers were asking, is there anything else we can do beyond sanctions, or are our moves really limited?
Yeah, well, I agree with Thomas. Obviously now everybody agrees that the sanctions will not deter Russia from going further and will not force Putin to recalculate his actions. However, obviously sanctions are absolutely necessary to punish Russia for what has happened, and also because we absolutely need to show that we are credible and that we have said that we would sanction Russia with massive consequences if something like this were to happen. And this is obviously time to show that we were serious about this. A second sort of aspect of this sanction question is what happens next. The sanctions are important because we need to have leverage in the next phase of this crisis. And obviously the threat of sanction alone does not give you any leverage. Having the ability to have hurt the Kremlin at the beginning of this invasion may also give us more options in the next weeks or months when we have a conversation about the future of Ukraine. Maybe what can be done beyond sanctions? There, I'm afraid on Ukraine, not much. However, as it was mentioned by the other speakers, this is only the beginning. There are other risks for European security, and there are things that can be done. In terms of disinformation, a series of European countries have already announced that they would put Russian media, state media, under special supervision. The French official digital authority has said that RT France would be potentially banned from broadcasting if any sort of propaganda was made. And also on the question of migration and helping the EU countries that are around Ukraine and may feel the impact of the conflict very quickly because of the migrant flows. And there you have certain tools and instruments. There are discussions about using the Article 122 of the EU treaty that would enable the European Commission and European Council to provide special economic assistance to EU countries in a situation of exceptional occurrences like this one. These kind of tools would help us send solidarity and show our solidarity towards our partners around Ukraine. Maybe last point, I really want to underline what has been said by Thomas before about the significance of the US strategic documents that are to be released in early 2022, the National Defense Strategy, National Security Strategy. These documents were in any way extremely important to understand the future of the transatlantic relationship, understand the future of European security. Given what has happened over the past 24 hours, these documents are even more important. They will truly define the future of US defense posture on the continent and will change the way us Europeans will react in the months to come to the continuous aggression from Russia.
Thank you very much, Martin. Martin. Liana, over to you again in DC. We also get some questions in the Q&A feed about what is now actually the end game of Putin. I mean, you pointed at some of the blind spots. What if Russia actually succeeds in filling those blind spots? Do we have any contingency planning in place? What can we do to address some of the blind spots that you did identify?
Thank you, Bruno. I think certainly the military power that Russia has amassed at its borders and that it is now using also in the western part of Ukraine, I mean, west of Kyiv, certainly shows that, as Michał said, those are maximalist aims. So we have to think about providing security to those that might have to leave Kyiv soon or are leaving Kyiv now. And of course, the population, but also decision makers, members of parliament, the president, the government, where are they going to go? This is something which has to be thought through. So providing security to those who were the elite, the democratic elite in Ukraine, and especially also to those activists that fought for a new and a democratic Ukraine. The other points that we should be aware of, and it has been mentioned by Thomas, the sanctions piece, the Russian president has tried to bluff a little bit in his discussions and in his speech, pretending as if Western sanctions would have come anyway and that Russia is well prepared. Sanctions might perhaps not change the calculus, but they will have a damaging impact on the Russian economy, which feeds back into the initial point that I tried to raise. What does this do to regime stability? I mean, we already see right now that the Russian ruble is collapsing, that we do see capital flight, and that is even in anticipation of those sanctions. So again, what does it to regime stability if Russia just becomes a much poorer country as an outcome of this war? The other point that we should also perhaps think even closer about is retaliation. So there will be Russian retaliation for Western sanctions, and Russian retaliations have in the past usually been asymmetric. So they have usually been a little bit more than Western sanctions have been. So in return for Russia Today not getting a TV license in Germany, DEW was entirely blocked from Russia, for instance. So what could these sanctions look like? Obviously energy sanctions, but also the cyber part is something where we as Europeans should expect to be threatened and potentially under cyber attacks. This is something which the National Security Council in the NSC in Washington has warned against and has warned Europeans against, that they should prepare for this kind of counter sanctions from the Russian side. And we already see right now that this seems to be a cyber war going on in the backdrop of the actual war in Ukraine, with reports about the Kremlin website being down at the moment. And this is something which will certainly also extend to Europe. So if there's a moment, now would be a really good moment to shore up our own cyber defenses. And then perhaps the last point, when it comes to European security and the future of European security, if this is such a turning point, we also have to think, sort of to take into account that Russia now has a seat at the table in European security. So this is not what we had in the 90s. Russia is now defining European security in a new way. So there's also a task for us ahead of thinking in terms of narratives, and I don't want to say visions, because then everyone quotes Helmut Schmidt, especially at the GMF. But there is a need to think about narratives in terms of how do we want European security and European order to look like. I mean, in the past, Europe whole and free was the narrative which was so successful. What is going to be our explanatory vehicle to describe this new confrontation that we are going to, not only for ourselves, because it helps for us to make good policy decisions, but also to our publics. And I find this return to the Cold War narrative always insufficient, but what is the other narrative, how we can explain what is ahead of us?
Thank you very much. Jonathan, maybe also a question for you. I mean, the United States, made a lot of, or shared a lot of intelligence about potential timings of the start of the war. Some viewers are, asking if we can comment on the timing of the conflicts. Why is it happening now? Perhaps this is something that you could address. And another question maybe also for you, Jonathan, given that you work so much in the region, should we also be fearing for action in Georgia and Moldova? What's your view on that?
Yeah, I think there's a real concern. I'll start with the last question about, these other spaces too. And it shouldn't be lost on anybody. Of course, Russia has, when you talk about Moldova, that there's Russian troops in Moldova, there's Russian troops in Georgia, Russian troops in Armenia, Russian troops in Azerbaijan. So there's a pattern here. And so Georgia is particularly vulnerable right now, not only because of internal challenges politically, but because you have significant Russian forces already, very close to the capital, Tbilisi, and the same for Chisinau and for Maya Sandu's government. Moldova is a neutral country. It doesn't have designs on joining NATO. But when you hear Mr. Putin speaking, you see that he is targeting and has targeted previously these two countries. They're not the only ones that are vulnerable. Michał spoke about the changes in Belarus as well. Both Poland, Baltic countries also increasingly vulnerable. And let's not forget about the border of Ukraine with Romania, Hungary, Slovakia as well. So there's game changers in all these spaces, the Black Sea region as well. And so I think I'd like to see, and I think others too, is how can we best support and engage those countries right now to strengthen their security, but also address other needs as well, which include countering disinformation and other hybrid activity. On the timing. This is, the billion-dollar question of, sort of Mr. Putin's, what was in his mind and desire. Obviously, the military buildup started a long time ago. Ukraine's been in an 8-year war, with Russia and illegal annexation of Crimea that occurred in 2014, close to 14,000 killed in the Donbass, and then a military buildup that started quite early, more significantly this year. And a pretend to like remove, Russia never removed troops and equipment from this space, but built it out only further. And I think that the administration, one of the things I think that was important that they did is they did quite openly sort of highlight and share the intelligence information, not only with partners and allies, but really globally. And that's why I think the outrage is where it is today, which this is a conflict perpetrated by Mr. Putin. And it's quite clear based on this information provided. I think there's a deep understanding of this.
Thank you very much, Jonathan. Colleagues, we are nearing the end of this briefing. We have about officially one minute left, but I still wanted to get back to each one of you, see perhaps if you have some last pressing thoughts to share or comments. Now would be the last opportunity to do so. Thomas, you're unmuted.
Yeah, I am unmuted now. Thank you. So there's a couple of questions in this in the Q&A about the end game. To that, I want to hark back to what Liana and Michał said. We have to take Mr. Putin seriously and as to what he says. And he hasn't only said something, he has written something in the December 17 draft treaty to NATO and to the United States. And that you find in the form of onion rings as goals. His first goal is about Ukraine. The second goal is about the eastern flank and the rollback of military material on the eastern flank. And the third back is about Amigo home and the end of the nuclear deterrence and replacement of nuclear deterrence by a Russian nuclear deterrence umbrella. To me, this is, in the end, to have US missiles in Virginia, Russian missiles in Kaliningrad, 4 flight minutes from Berlin. That, to me, reads like the little brother of the 1952 Stalin note in the Stalin letter of neutralizing Germany. So in my view, two things about two of the onion rings are necessary to do. One is bolster the eastern flank. The Suwalki gap is now gaping with the changes of the strategic landscapes in Belarus. That is an immediate need. And secondly, we need to think about the nuclear threat that Mr. Putin, by the way, there was a nuclear threat in his declaration this morning. We need to think about the nuclear threat and how to respond to that. And finally, glide vehicles were tested 2 days before the invasion. I can't see that as a coincidence. That is part of the strategic weapons picture that we're looking at and need a response to.
Thank you very much for this end assessment, dear Thomas. And I also wish to thank all my colleagues in various capitals that joined for this briefing. GMF will keep track of the situation, and I'm sure we'll be organizing more of such analysis and briefings in the coming days and weeks. Meanwhile, I wish all our colleagues and friends in Ukraine safety, stay safe, good luck, and we'll be in touch very soon with you, dear viewers. Good evening or good morning from where you were watching.